Okay, so what I'm going to talk about is the rubrics associated with the three different parts of the edTPA. What I highly suggest is that you spend a lot of time with the first part, with the planning part. The planning part is reflected both in instruction and in assessment. So it just makes sense to ensure that what you did in planning is targeted. In other words, that the learners that you select, their abilities in terms of strengths and areas of need are directly aligned with what you are asking them to do in terms of a performance standard. You also have content standards. So their ability or their performance standards, or what they can do, is primary, and secondary will be how do I figure out access within the general education curriculum. So it's about access, it's about participation within that environment, and it's about progress. So here's our overview of what I'm going to present. Just an overview or discussion about rubrics in general. And this will be from the perspective of you as a learner, you in terms of edTPA, but also you in terms of the teacher using rubrics for the students that you work with. Then I'm going to, again, briefly state some of the tasks that are involved with the edTPA so you can see where things align with the rubrics. So there's a narrative to edTPA, which Dr. Yana was talking about, telling you what you need to do. That narrative is directly aligned or associated with the rubrics. So I also have to, in a way, reiterate the tasks so you can see the connections within the rubrics. Then we'll get into some presentations. Really, I'm going to show you 3 of the 5 columns in the 15 rubrics. And the reason I'm going to show you only 3 is because I want you first to orient yourself with a score of a 4, a level 4. And to the left and to the right, you're going to see a level 3 and a level 5. A level 5 is the highest you can get on any rubric. So if you, but a level 5 would say all of level 4 plus this, or plus these items or criteria. So it makes sense to start with level 4, make sure you have everything you need in level 4, and then see what additional aspects you can incorporate for level 5. So essentially, if you don't score 5, you will score 4. But it's good to show you what a 3 is to make sure that your 4 is above and beyond what a 3 is. So we're not going to focus on a 3, but we'll look at it. But our goal is to make sure we hit number 4 and then see how we can also improve number 4 or level 4. I'm going to use the same language, level 4 to get a level 5. So why? So what's the purpose of rubrics? So individuals, and the reason I use that type of language is to let you know that it could be a learner, the learner could be you, the learner could be the students that you work with, or it could be the person that's evaluating the learner, which would be the person who is reading your edTPA, which could be you scoring your students' work. You're going to use it to examine instruction and assessment. So rubrics are for both. So essentially what you're looking for is consistency. So that's why I said the planning aspect of edTPA, you have planning, part 1 or task 1, instruction, and then assessment. You want to look for consistency, and you want to see that throughout. So reviewers or scorers of edTPA are going to make sure, or let me rephrase that, they're not going to make sure, they're going to look for consistency throughout the 3. Another reason why we can use rubrics is we want to define performance expectations. It helps us in terms of clarity. What is the student supposed to do? How are they supposed to do whatever it is? And when are they doing it? And again, what was explained earlier, how are things defined? And how is it operationalized in terms of a definition? So you might say the student will do X, Y, and Z, but then you also have to contextualize for the person reading your edTPA what it looks like in the classroom environment. So again, it goes back to clarity of language, making sure you proofread, and what I suggest is that when you go through your edTPA, think of the individual who is reading it as a person who is not as knowledgeable in education as you would assume or think they would be. So I'm going to rephrase that in a different way. You want to make sure that when they read your edTPA narrative or your 3 different parts, that you provide sufficient information so there's no ambiguity. So that way they don't feel that they need to ask questions to try and figure out what you're trying to say. But don't provide so much information that it becomes redundant and it's unclear to them. This is where the page requirements, like 11 pages, single-spaced, that sort of thing, is going to come into play. You are going to have to try and figure out, where do I provide more information, and where could I be as concise as possible. You want to make sure that they understand exactly what you did, why you did it, and the connections between teaching and learning. What you did as the adult to change the behaviors of the learner. So essentially, think of this whole edTPA process as the behaviors of the adults are going to be reflected or should be reflected in the outcomes of the behaviors of the learners. So what you do affects how they interact with the learning environment and how they will actually perform. Naturally, the learner has to put enough effort in to result in an outcome. But that effort is also regulated by what you do or ask the student to do. So a lot of it is within your control. Again, evaluate the learner. Subjectivity is key, but based on the data. The learner can also evaluate him or herself. So rubrics not only help the learner understand what he or she needs to do, it's also a tool that you use. So both individuals use the rubric within the teaching environment. So they can be quantitative, they can be qualitative, and they can be both. So within a cell of a rubric, you can have only quantitative cells. For example, the essay must contain at least 3 topic sentences. So that's quantitative. A qualitative aspect in that cell could be topic sentences must include a minimum of this. The this is what you want to explain in terms of defining what the topic sentence would entail. So essentially, the topic sentence is going to tell you what the paragraph is going to be about, which then tells you the subsequent sentences are going to be reflections of that topic sentence. The next thing would be to make sure in a qualitative rubric, or if the rubric is both qualitative and quantitative, that the terms that you use are terms that everyone understands within the context that you are providing. So a hypothetical again would be well-defined. So if you use the term well-defined in a qualitative rubric, what does well-defined mean? If we do not define it and operationalize it, so we define what well-defined is, and then we provide a context or an exemplar of or parameters for what well-defined is, the reader or the learner who's using the rubric is not going to know what a well-defined topic sentence is. So you need to include the elements within the cell that will let the learner know what he or she needs to demonstrate. So that's you as the educator working with the learner. Now you as the educator completing the edTPA process need to look at these rubrics that we're going to talk about and say to yourself, are there any quantitative aspects here that I need to make sure that I address? Check. What are some of the qualitative things that I need to make sure that I address? Check. So when you're saying that to yourself, you have to say to yourself, okay, when they say I have to have an adaptation, when do I need to have an adaptation? Do I need to have it for every single one of the rubrics? Not necessarily. What you need to do is provide adaptations only when the needs of the learner require it. So again, it goes back to my previous conversation. It's less about the content, but it starts with the learner. If you start with the learner, then you can address everything in edTPA, because you start with the learner and work your way out. So start with the strengths and the areas of need for the learner, and you capitalize on strengths, and you try to remediate and improve weaknesses. So essentially what you're going to do is you are going to provide opportunities for the learner to be successful via strengths, and then you start with their strongest weakness. So you think of a scope and sequence. You're not going to start with their weakest weakness. You start with the strongest one, improve that, support them in terms of progression, then move on to the next weakest, move on to the next weakest. The rationale there is, if you start with the strengths, then start with the strongest weakness, and you progressively work your way down to where they struggle the most, they eventually are going to demonstrate a history of success. The reason why they most likely are in special education in terms of receiving services is because they had a history of failure. So here is another example of where we have to try and understand what some of the terms mean if it were a qualitative rubric. This is just a statement, but I'm going to use it as a reason why we need to make sure that whoever is reading our edTPA portfolio understand what full understanding is and understand wide range of skills. Just look at it, think about it. I'm going to throw a couple of questions at you to kind of play on the words a little bit to help it make more sense. The learner should be able to engage with rubrics in ways that allow him and or her to demonstrate full understanding and a wide range of skills in authentic contexts. Think about this in two ways. Individually, the learner as an individual, and then the learner within an environment that's inclusive. So let's start with the individual first. If you are working with only one individual, how would you explain full understanding or wide range of skills if you were writing some sort of narrative? This is not a trick question. Just think about full understanding for that learner. It could be any learner, so full understanding can mean anything. And wide range of skills within a rubric. Because if you think about them within a rubric, then you can think about yourself within the edTPA rubric. What goes across your mind? And you could pick any content area. Math, because we have literacy, math, science, social studies. Those are some of the areas that they say you can use. Or you can not use a content area and just talk about it in general terms. Think about standards. Because the whole purpose of this, or whole purpose of education, is that every grade level has a standard. We have expectations for students at every grade level. But every student in every grade level does not perform similarly in that respective grade level. So you have a range of learners. So there's variability. So if you have variability within grade levels, you automatically have a wide range of skills. You automatically have differences in terms of understanding. So essentially what I'm going to do right now is I am going to explain or model the individual level, and as I talk about the individual level in terms of full understanding and wide range, then I'm going to ask you to talk to me or to talk to us or talk with us about what does full understanding and wide range mean within a grade level, which is a classroom. So a learner can demonstrate his or her full understanding, but that full understanding may not be representative of what we would want to expect for that grade level via the standards. So it goes back to my previous comment earlier with the previous presentation, where we start with the learner first, and that learner's present level of performance may not be at grade level, but we are still trying to use the same content topics and trying to figure out a way to make it accessible to that learner, but that learner is not demonstrating it at that grade level. So full understanding might be full understanding at that learner's level, but not full understanding at the grade level. So you may have another learner in that same classroom who is demonstrating full understanding in terms of the individual, but it happens to be that his or her full understanding is also at the full understanding of that grade level expectation. You guys follow me? Now, the wide range of skills that learner might show, the learner who is struggling or needs support, might show a wide range of skills, but those wide range of skills are not in line, directly in line with the grade level expectations. You may also have another individual in the classroom who has a wide range of skills, who also demonstrates an alignment with grade level expectations. So you see how using a qualitative rubric can be very difficult? So what I try to do when I design rubrics, I try to give every effort to have both quantitative and qualitative. There's pros and cons to both. If you try to constrain within a rubric, then you might limit. If you try to open it up too much, then there's such a range, it becomes very difficult to score or grade. So what I'm trying to do right now is, before we get into the rubrics, I'm trying to help you conceptualize how rubrics are designed. So when you're looking at the rubric for your edTPA, you can try and figure out and say to yourself, what are they really looking for here? Because remember, everybody in the state of New York is going to pick two different learners. They cannot individualize that cell, level 3, because I'm only going to show you 3 of the 5, 3, 4, and 5. They cannot individualize 4 and 5 for every single grade level. So now, do you see where I'm coming from now? I'm coming from a different angle now. So what you have to try and figure out is, on your own, how am I going to align these generic, because those cells in those rubrics are fairly generic. They're specific, but they are generic. They're generic in this sense. The reviewer or scorer does not know who the learner is. So those cells don't make much sense until they know who the learner is. So that's why it's so important to make sure that you can describe the learner extremely well. Because if you can describe that learner or those two learners extremely well, then it helps you to identify strategies, identify content, identify any type of support that will help those learners be able to access the curriculum. Then those cells at level 4 and level 5 begin to come to life. They start to make sense. So whether using a rubric as an evaluator or learner, you should be able to see connections. So you are going to see connections within a rubric. So from 3 to 4 to a 5. You're going to see a progression at that row where it's going to become more and more complex. Also, there's the possibility that when you look at the different rows in the rubric, there are going to be connections. What I talked about earlier about consistency. So there are 5 rubrics for planning, 5 rubrics for instruction, 5 rubrics for assessment. At each of those 3 different tasks, there are 5 different rubrics. If you were to put all 15 together into one huge rubric, like on one page, you would start seeing these connections within the columns. So all the 3s, you will start seeing connections, or you should see connections. But there's also the possibility that when you yourself try to design rubrics, you may also have sections that are not directly connected. So another example or way of saying that would be that maybe your rubric is a writing rubric. You might have a section on syntax. You might have a section on semantics. You might have a section on organization. So even those are different sections within a rubric, as a whole, those different sections or isolated discrete sections represent the student's overall writing ability. So there's still connections, but within those different sections may not be, or across those different sections may not be direct relationships, but as a whole, it paints a picture. So essentially, the edTPA is going to paint a picture for the reviewer about how well you understand those two learners' needs, where they are, and how well you can plan for their strengths and weaknesses based on the grade level that they're in and the type of curriculum that you are working with, where you need to make adaptations, modifications, accommodations, etc., to ensure those learners have access, are participating within the environment, and also are progressing. So essentially, what you're looking for is a developmental scope and sequence based on the learner's strengths and weaknesses. Developmental based on you have to have 3 to 5 lesson plans. So developmentally, lesson 1 of the 5 is going to be where you start. It could be anywhere, wherever you start in terms of the curriculum. You start with that learner's needs. You give them something new to learn or work on. Then lesson 2, you are reinforcing what was taught previously in the first lesson. You might be introducing something new in lesson 2 that is developmentally appropriate in terms of intensity and progression. So you don't want to go so fast in terms of pacing that you have gaps in between lesson 1 and lesson 2, and gaps between lesson 2 and lesson 3. You don't want to go so slow where lesson 1 is almost indistinguishable from lesson 2, and lesson 2 is almost indistinguishable from lesson 3. If that's the case, it might be just an example of one long, very long lesson. So things to keep in mind. Some advantages to rubrics, right? You can align them with standards. So when you look at your task stream assignments, you notice how all the task stream assignments have standards in there? They're based on the standards. So you can design rubrics that use the language of the standards. And that's what the task stream assignments have. The language that's in the cells are representative of the standards that you are supposed to demonstrate as an educator. You can do the same thing with your students. The same thing is happening with edTPA. They may not directly tell you what the standards are, but what you are going to demonstrate, because it's a performance assessment, you are going to demonstrate what you need, what you are supposed to do as an educator to improve outcomes for learners. It's supposed to be informative, both for yourself and for the learner. It provides an opportunity for you to consistently grade. Otherwise, if you try and grade assignments or grade edTPA portfolios, you might just arbitrarily grade them for different reasons. Some might have inflated scores because maybe it just has no grammatical syntax errors, but the content isn't really there, but it flowed and they were able to read it. Maybe someone else's portfolio was technically targeted, but there are so many errors in terms of syntax and spelling and that sort of thing, it throws them off that they actually get thrown off and have a difficult time trying to understand what you're saying. It's structured. Rubrics provide a structure. Some of the criticism might be that it's so structured that it's limiting creativity. We'll get to that a little bit. It's supposed to be objective, but if the qualitative terms that you are using are not defined and operationalized, then it's not as objective as you may think. So now here's a barrier. Here's the difference between some of the advantages and some of the differences. So some of the difficulties with rubrics would be the time required to develop, test via iterator reliability, etc. So essentially, if you are designing a rubric in isolation, like only you are designing that rubric, that's not the best way to go about it. The best way is to try to do it with your grade level. And the way edTPA rubrics were designed, they had committees and people at different stages in their careers, different roles and responsibilities. Look at these rubrics and try to figure out what are the essential elements that special educators or any educator trying to become initially certified in various fields, ELA, mathematics, science, social studies, etc., what do they need to demonstrate? So each field determine what are the essential markers that are needed. It's hard to parse understanding and doing. So with rubrics, sometimes students might know a lot more than what they demonstrate. So that you have to think about that when you write up your edTPA. Did I fully demonstrate my understanding? Your understanding is based on what you did, which then reflects on how well or what the students are doing or did. Limiting. Sometimes rubrics can constrain. So you can have a student that wrote a lot more than what was expected in the rubric, and that student got a 5 out of 5. You can have another student that wrote just enough to score a 5. So that's where the quantitative and qualitative aspects come into play. So you have two different learners scoring the same, but their knowledge and skills are very different. Same thing can happen in edTPA. They can be confusing if the evaluator or the learner attend to too many criteria. So your rubric has to be specific enough to elicit certain behaviors so you can be able to score it or understand what your student knows and can do. But having so many might throw that learner off. It also might throw you off. Sometimes used primarily as a tool for testing rather than a connected tool used consistently over time. So it goes back to that other comment that I made, that rubrics, just like an edTPA, are going to reflect what you did over time. So that's why they want to see 3 to 5 lesson plans, and your planning has to be based on 3 to 5 lesson plans. So that learning segment is a short learning segment, but it's a snapshot of your ability. Now we're at the second part of our presentation, the summary of the tasks, which then will be associated with the rubrics. We just finished the first part. So some of the definitions in edTPA. So they call curricular areas these areas: academics, functional, and then they say literacy or numeracy. I would say stay with this if you can. Independence, whether it's functional or adaptive. Expanded core curriculum for students who are visually impaired. Learning strategies and social skills. So my suggestion would be to stay around literacy and numeracy and learning strategies. But if you have a student with where you want to do a behavioral intervention with, then you can definitely do social skills as well. So your charge is to develop critical concepts and skills that are applicable to the real world for the functional level. Help the learner demonstrate consistent progress from basic to transitional knowledge and skill. So basic knowledge could be at kindergarten, 8th grade, that sort of thing. But when you're working with functional skills, when you're here, functional, you want them to become independent, right? The transition part is when they start getting into high school and they start moving into the real world. That's why this is so important. Real world has to be authentic. Has to be meaningful to the learner, and something that will be meaningful so when they're reviewing it and they'll say, oh, you know what? This educator is preparing this student for life after school. But that's only if you are going to work on the functional aspect. If you're working on the literacy, numeracy, and learning strategies, social skills, you're not necessarily working at the functional level. Technically, whatever you teach them is going to be like a function of that behavior so they can accomplish something. But the way this is being used in edTPA is really about functional, like life skills, abilities, that sort of thing. So they call a learning segment 3 to 5. So you might have goals and objectives for each lesson, but as a whole, these 3 to 5 lessons result in a learning segment. That learning segment essentially will have like a goal of its own. So for every 3 to 5 lessons, what's the overall goal that you're trying to accomplish for those students? And that's for 2 focused learners. So it reflects access and supports for the learners. So in those learning segments, you have to focus on or write enough so they can say to themselves, when they're reviewing your edTPA, how did this educator provide access for these learners to this curriculum? And by providing access to this curriculum, were there supports that were necessary? And naturally, you have to have supports. Otherwise, there will be no need to provide access. Does that make sense? So you really have to focus on both. It can't be just one or the other. If you select 2 learners, focused learners, that means those learners somehow, some way need access to the general education curriculum. Somehow, some way, they can't get this access alone without any type of support. You have to provide some sort of support. The access and the supports need to be aligned with the learner needs. So I'm going to drill this, I'm going to just keep on saying it so it can stick. Start with the learner's needs. That way you know what type of supports and access that needs to be provided for them to do well. And we talked about this earlier. So it can be an individual in terms of the learning segment, or it can be the 2 individual focused learners in a group. And what you're doing is, as the individual, meaning you're working with that individual student, or the individual students in the group, it's business as usual. So when you are writing about, I work with this student on one-on-one, you are not taking them out of the learning environment to work with them one-on-one for edTPA. You are taking them out because it's required of you as the educator to help them be able to access the general education curriculum, and you're providing them supports as learners. If it's in a group, small group, for example, it's business as usual. They are not learning in the whole class environment. You will have to take them out after some sort of teaching, take them out and work with them in a small group because they need additional supports to be able to access the general education curriculum. Or you just might have the two learners, if they are at a higher level, you may not need to take them out as individual learners. You may not need to take them out in a small group. They can function well enough in the whole class environment, inclusive environment, with students with and without exceptionalities, well enough if you provide them enough supports that will allow them to access the general education curriculum. I'm kind of trying to be redundant in a way to try and show you the different levels and how access and supports work in varied ways, whether individually, in small group, or in whole group. What service delivery model can you think about that provides these types of flexible supports, whether students need it, in schools? It's based on students' responsiveness to the instruction. What comes to mind? And it's primarily for students who are categorized with learning disabilities.
Can you rephrase that question?
Sure, I'll say it in a different way. If you are trying to progress monitor, I'll give you the elements of this model or service delivery model. You can also use this service delivery model to help you identify students. You are providing data, you are collecting data in terms of progress monitoring. Over a course of X amount of weeks, you may flexibly move them from individual to small group to whole group based on how they perform. So it's based on their responsiveness. You are also using research-based strategies, interventions, programs that are specifically validated for the type of learner you are working with. This is in direct relationship to what you're also being asked to do in edTPA.
Tier?
Yeah, tiered system. So it's responsiveness to intervention.
RTI.
Yeah. So think about RTI and think about this, what I just talked about. It's really the same thing to a certain degree, right? Because what they're asking you to do in terms of instruction and assessment, they're asking you to use assessments that are really sensitive enough to growth, to give you enough feedback to be able to know how to refine or inform your instruction. So you're doing this on on an ongoing basis. Unfortunately, you can't demonstrate this fully within 3 to 5 days because your lessons are 3 consecutive lessons, 3 to 5 consecutive lessons. RTI, in terms of the full model, varies depending on how you set it up. It could be 6 weeks, 8 weeks, 12 weeks, it varies. So a student may not be able to demonstrate full responsiveness in 3 to 5 days. So here's another deep level reflective thought I want you to get into. So that means when you're designing your lessons have to be tight enough or targeted in terms of specificity so almost like a one-to-one correspondence in terms of match with the student's needs and a match with what they're being asked to do for you to be able to see what they're capable of doing. Otherwise, I'm going to go back. It goes back to this. It's limiting, because if it's too sensitive when you're using a rubric or you're trying to assess the student, you may not have enough room to show growth. If it's too broad, the growth that the student is demonstrating may not be captured via the assessments that you're using. So the learning segment it's expressed in edTPA as should. So it says in edTPA, when you read the manual or the handout, it says the learning segment should align with relevant academic or non-academic standards and or goals or benchmarks specified in IEP. In the IEP, right? But what I'm saying to you is, don't think of it as should. The learning segment must align with relevant academic. The non-academic would be like the functional aspects. So I would suggest that if your student doesn't need functional supports, try to find students who need academic supports, because your background and your knowledge in terms of your strengths are primarily based on instructional strategies for academics. So capitalize on your strengths as well for edTPA. And it must, in terms of the learning segment, remember the learning segment is 3 to 5 lessons, consecutive lessons. So it's aligned with relevant academic and reflective or reflects appropriate adaptations of the learning environment, content, and instructional strategies. Let's look at the word relevant, because they use, think about the qualitative aspects. Earlier we were talking about, well, what if my student is at the 4th grade level, but I'm using a 10th grade curriculum? See how they use the word relevant? If I were you, that's the type of words I'll be using in my narratives and my commentaries. So when you're saying this student performs at the 10th grade level, unfortunately, she cannot access the general education curriculum at the 10th grade level. The student reads at the 4th grade level. So you provided relevant academic supports with that 10th grade curriculum, but based on that learner's 4th grade abilities. That helps the reviewer see that you are making connections between the learner and the learner's strengths and weaknesses or needs and the curriculum, meaning the standards. So it's both the performance standards or the performance that the learner is going to demonstrate and how that performance is aligned or associated with the learner's profile, learning profile, and the grade level. So you are there making connections. Those same relevant academic connections you're going to make should also be in the environment. So the environment can be individual supports, small group supports, whole class supports, to enable the learner to be able to access the general education curriculum. Adaptations of can also be in terms of the content. Do you need to only provide accommodations? Accommodations do not change the content of the curriculum, but modifications change the content in terms of the curriculum. And based on the environment and the content, what types of instructional strategies did you use? Which all are associated with the learner. So there's a connection between the environment, the content, and the instructional strategies, but all of those, you don't even start thinking about these three different areas in terms of how you reflect adaptations until you fully understand the needs of the learner. If you do not fully understand the needs of the learner and the strengths of the learner, you cannot fully describe how the environment aligns with the learner. You cannot fully describe how the content needs to be how the content either needs to be modified or how you might need to provide accommodations for the learner. And you cannot fully describe how the learner and the strategies are aligned. Whenever you have misalignment between these three areas and the alignment between the academic, the curriculum, that is when you are going to fall from a 5 to a 4 to a 3 to a 2 and to a 1. The more misalignment you have, the farther you go in terms of a lower score. The more alignments you have, the stronger your score will be. How's this pace? Is my pace okay for you? All right. I'm going to get you more involved first. I'm just building some background. So, as soon as we finish the summary of tasks, we'll get into more discussion. So I'm giving you the overview. So here's the one-to-one context instead of a group. Like I mentioned this already. You have to explain a rationale if you're doing one-to-one. But that's not a big deal if you indicate in your narrative or your commentary that the reason why you have one-to-one is because this is how you typically conduct instruction in the school for X, Y, and Z. And the X, Y, and Z is going to be based on what? The IEP. Or you might say, based on data, how I'm assessing this student, looking at the instruction, this is the best way currently, without any reference to the IEP, to enable the student to gain access to the general education curriculum, and via one-to-one support, I am providing these types of strategies. I am working on the environment in this way. I am working on the content in this way. I am working on the instructional strategies in this way. So what I'm trying to do now is trying to help you see the connections. As long as you provide the connections and a rationale for it, the reviewer is going to feel confident that you are providing the learner targeted instruction and assessment. There may be times, and this happens all the time, that an IEP was written, but the IEP stays the same, but the learner moves along, right? The goals are where you expect or project. It's an estimation of where you believe the learner, based on the learner's prior history, learning history, not just the scores that they got, but based on their prior learning history. So that's another little type of commentary you may want to include. That if you only talk about how they scored, it doesn't tell the reviewer what the score means. So talking about the learning history, meaning how well or at what pace the learner learns, informs the reviewer why the learner is scoring where he or she is scoring. So just giving them a score saying, oh, they're at the this grade level, but if you tell them at the rate of growth and what types of support and reinforcement is needed to get them there, then the reviewer will say to him or herself, no wonder she has to take them out and do one-on-one, because she is trying to pre-teach the content to that learner before that learner goes into the whole group inclusive environment, so they don't fall behind at the initial lesson when the content area teacher in math is talking about integers. Or that learner might need a little bit more support before you put that learner into a small group. Otherwise, you might say, this learner is so far behind or there's such a large gap between the grade level and the learner's performance that the only way to increase that learner's rate of growth is to provide intensive instruction, one-on-one instruction. So you have to provide a rationale. So you're not making it up. It's all based on the learner and the learner's needs and how the learner interacts with the academic content. It has to be relevant to the learner, and there's an alignment there, and the interaction between environment, content, and instruction. They say at least one of the two learning targets must be related to a goal in the IEP. I would say make both related to a goal in the IEP. What does that do for you in terms of explanation? Does it make it easier, harder, if you use two IEP goals? When you write it up in the edTPA.
The question is, what are
if I rephrase the question, you have two options. Let's just say essentially using one learning target that uses an IEP, and then another learning target that doesn't necessarily use an IEP. Then another option would be to say, you know what, if they're telling me at least one needs to be an IEP, I'm not going to use just one, I'm going to use both.
Yes.
So both learning targets are going to have IEP goals.
Yeah.
What's the pro and con to both options? Now, your options are not arbitrary. Again, the options are based on the learners that you have. But if I were doing this myself, I would choose one over the other. And there's a reason why I would choose one over the other for the purposes of edTPA. So I can demonstrate something. In terms of ease for myself, in terms of how I'm reflecting on issues and profiles and connections and matching things well. What comes to your mind for those two types of options?
I think it's probably easier to match, to relate the two learning targets to the two goals in the IEP, because you'd have a basis. But then again, not everything is in the IEP is sacrosanct, really.
Exactly.
It's not.
That's why I said
Kids evolve.
yes. The IEP is static, but it's supposed to be reflective of what you believe the student's learning history demonstrated over the years. So you base that theoretically, or hypothesis in a way. I think if I do this, or if I provide them these types of goals and objectives, then they should be able, throughout the year, they should be able to result in this annual goal. You see where I'm going with that? You see how the research course comes into play, the if-then kind of statement?
If-then.
So, again, it goes back to the learner and where the learner is, which would then, if the IEP is not written very well, and you're like, oh no, I really can't find a goal or objectives, I can't figure out how to set up a learning target for this second one, I'm going to use the data that I have to indicate to the reviewer in my edTPA that this is how I am going to align relevant academic content or relevant academics with the environment, the content, and the learning strategies for the learner. If you do that, it's really no different than using two IEP goals. But if you have two strong IEP goals, hey, why invent the wheel? Use it. Because what it does for you, it provides you structure. It makes it a little bit easier. Well, we hope. If two focused learners have different needs, there may be two different learning targets to provide appropriate support. I should probably wrote, in order to provide appropriate support. That's what I should have wrote in there. Yes?
So the learning target is your goal, lesson plan goal, your lesson goal, your objective.
Mm-hmm.
It's the same word, right?
Well, the goals and objectives are different. I'm going to get into that. Yeah, so you have a goal, but then if you are doing lessons, individual lessons, 3 to 5 consecutive lessons, the objectives are more specific. So in a lesson, you might have a goal for the lesson. There are going to be objectives in that lesson that the students are going to go through these objectives or these specific tasks that you're going to ask the student to learn or demonstrate, which then reflect what the goal should be. Now, when you look at the goal and the objective, or the goal and the objectives within lessons, across lessons, lesson 1, lesson 2, lesson 3, lesson 4, lesson 5, the cumulative effects of these goals and objectives reflect the lesson segment, what they call the lesson segment. The lesson segment is 3 to 5 lessons. So in 3 to 5 lessons, essentially what they're saying is, every 3 to 5 lessons, your students should be able to accomplish X, Y, and Z. In order to accomplish this, you have to have discrete, incremental goals and objectives that bring that student to that lesson segment goal. So it's like going to the, I'm going to use the gym again. It's like going to the gym, and over the course you want to either lose weight or gain weight. So let's start with losing weight. If you want to lose weight, you got to figure out, instead of using 3 days, it's going to take us longer because, so we use 3 weeks instead of 3 lessons. So 3 weeks. 3 to 5 weeks. In order to lose weight in 3 to 5 weeks, you need to do different types of things. Maybe you start on a treadmill, you walk on the treadmill, then you walk faster pace on the treadmill, then you run on a treadmill, then you start to plateau with your weight, so you got to change it a little bit. Then you move on to the Stairmaster, and you move on to the elliptical machine. So by the 3rd week, you use 3 different types of machines in varied ways, which then help progress your weight loss. Because what happens in terms of intellect, the same thing happens. If you maintain your instructional level at the same level all the time, in those 3 to 5 different lessons, the student is not going to learn anymore. So you got to increase you got to change something. The environment, the content, the strategies, the intensity, the pacing. Something has to change to progressively move that student forward. That's where the assessment part comes in. The assessment part gives you feedback. That feedback tells you how to plan for your next instructional segment or for your next lesson. So now, if you wanted to gain weight in 3 to 5 weeks, well, not gain weight, actually, build muscle in 3 to 5 weeks, you are going to have to increase the weight or go there more often to get more exercise in. Something's going to have to change. It could be your diet as well. Eat more protein, eat more vegetables. Something is going to change. So the theme that you see here in these 3 examples, the academic example, the weight loss example, and the muscle building example, the running thread is it can't be consistent. There has to be connections between day 1 and day 2 and day 3 for academics, because that's their learning segment. But in the exercise examples, we're going to use weeks because it makes more sense for that context. From 3 to 5 weeks, you also have to change things. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to increase or decrease.
Yeah, because I'm trying to operationalize learning targets. I mean, is it the same as skills? Are you telling us what are the different skills?
Yeah, essentially what
to teach these kids?
Yeah, so so when you think about the learning target, you're thinking about, okay, what are the knowledge and skills that these students need to demonstrate? So what are you targeting? Like, what are you trying to teach them? What should they know and what should they be able to do?
And then we have to explain that as an overall reflection for lesson 1, 2, and 3. And they need to see if there are changes with the with the students' capacity to understand the lesson.
Exactly. Yep. Yep, exactly. You got it. This stuff gets very confusing. It only gets very confusing in terms of edTPA because I'm using the same exact language from the handout because I want to make sure that what you see in the PowerPoint is what you're going to read when you read it. So what I try to do is go into the manual and break down sentences.
The same word.
Same wording. When there are differences, I'll highlight it in different color or I'll do something like this. I'll tell you that it says should, but I'm telling you it shouldn't. The handbook should not say should. It should say must. Because should is not a requirement. It should, but it doesn't have to. So if you read it that way, oh, I should do that, but you know what? I can't figure out how to do it, so I'm not going to do it. You know what's going to happen? You're going to get scored low. You are going to get scored lower because the manual wasn't specific enough, and it's not your fault. So what I did when I went through it for this PowerPoint, I said to myself, how am I going to make sure that they understand the language? And one of the ways I figured this out for the rubric was to do an overview of the entire project again, but to make the connections between that and the rubric, using the language that they use, but then clarifying where appropriate. Like earlier when we talked about taught versus delivering instruction. There's a difference there. Because they state in this manual, they talk about teaching and learning. So you got to keep that in your mind. What did you do and what did they do? So the teaching is you, the learning is the two focused learners. So what you do is a reflection of what they do. Because you are the one that's planning their interactions with their education. So if you make it too hard, they're not going to learn. You make it too easy, they're not going to learn. You make it too hard, you might have behavior problems. You make it too easy, you might have behavior problems. But the type of learner might be different. Too hard, you might have students who sometimes are performing at a lower level, or even very, very smart students might behave. Too easy, sometimes the students who typically perform very low might be like, hey, I like this is no big deal. But then the ones who are very, very smart might start acting out. You see how you have these relationships? So here, they also bolded this for 2 learning targets for each learner in different curricular areas. So if you are using science and math, and you have 2 different learners who are not necessarily in the same group, in the same class, then you exponentially have to expand your narrative. Because now you're talking about 2 different learners in different areas. What does that do for your narrative? Think about your narrative, and there's so much to explain in this. Dr. Yon talked about this earlier. He said, try your best to have similarly profiled students. There's a benefit to doing that.
Because you only need 11 pages.
Yeah.
If you try to explain different areas, then you might need more than that.
Oh yeah, you might do a good job at demonstrating the wider range, but your level of depth naturally comes to the surface level. What you want to be able to do is be able to go as deep as necessary to fully answer every cell of the rubric and then stop. Or maybe go a little bit more and then stop. Because why give them more information than they need to score you? This is only a reflection of what you know and what you're capable of doing in terms of skills in the field, because it's a performance assessment. They don't need to see, they're looking for the minimum requirements. They're not going to rate you as, oh my goodness, these guys are master teachers, these guys are average. They're not going to do that. You pass or you don't.
So it's a pass or fail?
Oh, well, essentially that's what it is. You're going to get a score. There's going to be a range.
What's the lowest? Is it 3? Is the passing?
Dr. Yon, is it 45 points total or something like that?
I'm not sure.
I forgot the score.
Point breakdown of the college.
You're allowed to have like a couple of threes, but don't even think about a couple of threes.
Right.
Because the total number allows you to have a couple of threes and fours based on what your combinations are.
Mm-hmm.
But if you count on too many threes, you're not going to be able to pass.
Mm-hmm.
And you don't want to miss one section and have to go pay another $100 because you're off by 1 point. That's why I say start with 4, level 4. Make sure you nail level 4 perfectly, and then see how you can get a level 5. Because level 5 automatically says it's a level 4 plus this. So it automatically tells you, let me go level 4 first. It's the same logic that I expressed earlier when I said you have a minimum requirement of 3 lessons, do 4. If you have time to do 5, then do 5. But I would say do 4 really well every time you try to tape. That way you can pick which one of the 3 consecutive lessons you want to pick. But if you have time to do 5, then naturally do 5. But the amount of time it takes for you to plan 5 lessons, it might benefit you to plan only 4, because then you can probably write better lesson plans for 4 than you would for 5 if time is a constraint. So again, it's about surface versus depth. So in terms of developing a learning target, they said you can use these areas: literacy, mathematics, social studies, or science. Select one learning target, this is the first one, related to one of these content areas. So here's a little bit of confusion when I was reading it myself. I highlighted content in red. And then there's going to be another word that's going to be used later on called curricula, or curricular. Select an academic or functional learning target. This is, again, a review, but I would say focus on academic, whether such a goal is reflected in an IEP or not. And we already talked about that. And when you would have the option of using 2 IEP goals or learning targets and 1 IEP learning target and 1 without. Then, while you're still developing these learning targets, you select a second learning target in another curricular area representing a skill needed by the focused learner to access instruction or to demonstrate learning for the academic or functional learning targets. You see how all this is just like, it overlaps so much. So what you have to do is say to yourself, what are some of the key words I need to focus on? And you can already see that access is one, and the other one is learning, which is represented by the term supports. Because they can't learn unless they have the supports to enable them to learn. And if they are learning with the supports, that means they are also accessing the general education curriculum. Only if your lessons are relevant in terms of the academics, the relevance is related to the standards for that grade level. It doesn't have to be at that grade level, but it needs to be related to that grade level. That goes back to our conversation earlier. I feel kind of bad that I'm only talking to you, but there's no other way to do this. I have to explain all of this to you. Do you guys have any questions? I'm just checking for understanding right now.
Could you elaborate? Because A while ago, I got what learning target is, but
Mhm.
right now, because of this, I got confused with the learning target.
It's the same thing. You said the same thing. It's the same thing.
It's the same word.
Yeah, it's you are going to, the learning target is going to essentially let you as the educator know what your student knows and can demonstrate via skills. So it says here, the second learning target, just in another area, whatever the other area is. Remember the other areas were like learning strategies, the curricular areas were learning strategies, academics, independence. I'll go back. You see how they have curricular area here? Let's go back. It's going to be way ahead. Here we go. The book says curricular areas. Academics, learning strategies, social skills. You pick the one that you want to pick. So they say one of the learning targets needs to be in an academic area. It can be functional or it can be literacy and numeracy. I'm going to go forward again and we'll come back to this again, okay?
Yeah.
To show you the difference between the red highlighted word that says content and the red highlighted word that says curricular. So right now, we are looking at curricular. Curricular is the curriculum, right? The curriculum can be reflected in different ways depending on the learner. So it's always goes back to the learner. So if the learner is at the academic level, then you can focus on literacy or numeracy, which might be the first learning target. It says, in literacy, mathematics, social studies, or science, select one learning target. So your first learning target has to be a content area. Remember, they give you provisions. They'll say to you, essentially, if your students that you select or the school that you work in, say for example, you work in a school where it's with students who are developmentally delayed, students with autism, Asperger's, sometimes they're still going to ask you to do content because you can't just work on social skills. They go to school to learn content. But there's a heavy reliance on teaching them social skills. So just know that one of your learning targets has to be in a content area, but in terms of the curricula, it's here. Your other one can be in another curricular area. It could be this, it can be this, it can be this, it can be this. So I would say, pick a content area and focus on a learning strategy. So if we go back to the content area for the first target, where is it? The first learning target related to one of these content areas. Then we go to the second learning target in another curricular area, representing a skill needed by the focused learner. So essentially what they're looking for is so nuanced that it's like you need somebody to help you understand how to think about it. So they're saying essentially, how are you going to help the learner in the first, I gotta keep on looking because I have to make sure I use their own language. In the first learning target, how are you going to help them access the general education curriculum and provide supports if needed? Then they're saying, okay, now pick another one, another curricular area, say for example, learning strategies. How are you going in this second learning target help them demonstrate a skill that they need to focus on, which allows them to access instruction and demonstrate their learning. So if you use the language that they have in the handbook, and you talk about the second learning target, you say, okay, I picked this curricular area. The second learning target is in the area of blah blah blah, whatever it is. You pick learning strategies or whatever, right? Whereby Jane is going to represent or demonstrate the skill of blah 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 to be able to access the instruction. You see how you weave it, kind of try to weave it in.
Okay, like for example, you're teaching the student to read. Now that's one learning target. We're discussing comprehension, for example, reading comprehension. For example, one curricular area is academic, which is reading comprehension.
Okay, so you're saying learning target 1, you're right here, in
Yeah.
literacy.
For example, I'm going to choose academic, which is reading comprehension. The second learning target would be self-monitoring strategies. Which
Yeah.
is strategies.
Perfect.
Well, what about vocabulary? Because there is a correlation between
Sure.
vocabulary knowledge
Because
and
you
reading
are-
comprehension.
If you are teaching vocabulary, then you are primarily in a content area. But if your second learning target is vocabulary strategies,
Okay, that's the vocabulary.
then you are here.
Okay. Because
So what she was doing was because in literacy, whoops. If I had known that, I would put those two slides together. In literacy, if we talk about reading, phonemic awareness, phonics, fluency, vocabulary comprehension, you can say in literacy, Jane's going to focus on improving blah 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 comprehension. So you just gave the content. Then Christina, right?
Christine.
I thought I said I knew. All right, you should have corrected me.
Nina is my second name.
All right.
So you-
I can call you Nina.
okay.
All right. So I hate saying wrong names, but
No, it's
he's
okay.
recording me. I gotta be careful because
It's all right.
the recording's gonna come on a PowerPoint sometime, so in the future. So her example, Nina's example, was she is going to help them learn how to self-monitor. So she's going to teach them self-monitoring strategies. There is a relationship between the strategy and the content area. And if you do something like that, if I'm reading it, because I've seen Dr. Yon, I'm not going to bother him now. I just feel like bothering people. When he scores, he's like, oh, she knows what she's doing. That's what's going to go through their mind. You see what I'm saying? You see the connections. The connections are there. Oh, I gotta hurry up. I only have 20 minutes. Oops. Okay, so next slide. Oh, we already talked about that. Good. Same thing. So now, rubric 1 for planning. The goal. The goal is essentially a broad, ultimate outcome. Jane will demonstrate positive behavioral interactions with peers and adults. You don't know how to measure this. This is something you want them to be able to do. That means they can demonstrate this in multiple and varied ways. It's timeless. There's no specific time frame. There's something you want them to be able to do. So that's something they're going to be doing when they leave school for the rest of their life. Right? So that could be a goal in your lesson. But then, objectives, an outcome that is observable and measurable within a specific period of time. So your lesson objective is observable and measurable within that lesson. You have activities. It includes what will be done that will help the learner toward that lesson objective. That's when you talk about I do, we do, you do. You engage them in activities, or they get to participate to practice what you are trying to develop. They need to practice it. So rubric 1. So here's level 3, 4, and 5. You have 2 over here and 1 over here. We're not really going to look at this. We're going to look at this. For each focused learner, individualized education plan, goals and benchmarks, standards, lesson objectives, and learning tasks and materials are consistently aligned with each other. See, consistently aligned. You see how I kept on talking about that? They're going to look for that. Consistently aligned with each other and coordinate with state standards as appropriate. Remember, it's okay. They already know some students who receive special education services are below grade level. So what they're going to look for is the relevance or the relationship between what you're doing with the state standards. Lesson objectives include clearly defined measurable outcomes and build on each other to connect each focused learner's prior learning experiences and new learning. Again, what they're going to look for here in the bolded aspect here is consistently aligned. Now, if you have this, to get a 5, you have to go over here, and they're really going to look at and incorporate strategies to enhance generalization and maintenance and or self-directed use of knowledge and or skills. So, Nina, when you talked about self-monitoring or self-regulation, that self-directed use is another term for self-monitoring and self-regulation.
And when you talk about generalization, I think of Dr. Yon.
Mm-hmm.
He's a big proponent of he's a big proponent of generalization.
And our goal today is for you to take this information and generalize it to the edTPA. So the behavioral objectives. So behavioral objectives, you have 3 different parts. So when you're writing your lessons, you have the condition. So it's really the context or what's being presented to the student. So when presented with a task, then you have the action. What must be known or done? So when presented with a task, Jennifer will state ways that she can independently meet her needs. And the criteria, how you are going to measure it. How well the focused learner will demonstrate the knowledge or skill you're trying to teach. So when presented with a task, Jennifer will state ways that she can independently meet her needs 8 out of 10 times daily. Or in other words, you can say with 80% accuracy daily or on a daily basis. So you can change the language a little bit. So what I did here was, instead of doing primarily a instructional objective, I worked more on the social aspects here. Because one of your curricular areas is social skills. So essentially, I'm using a non-exemplar instructional, not using an instructional strategy. I'm using another type of curricular area to emphasize what it might look like in a different way. So now let's look at the rubric 2, planning, challenge, and support for focused learners. How does the candidate use knowledge? And I would highly, highly suggest this. These questions that you see under each rubric, make sure that you fully answer those questions via these. So how do candidates plan? How do the candidates' plans build knowledge and skills aligned to individualized education plan goals and benchmarks? How does the candidate use knowledge of the focused learners to tailor strategies to provide and support access to challenging curriculum and instruction? So here we go again. Focused learner comes first. Then strategies and curriculum and all the other stuff comes next. So here, for each focused learner, plan supports tied to lesson objectives and the learning targets of the learning segment. So I'm going to provide another level of clarification to help with the rubric. Your lesson objectives are essentially this, in a way, the same thing as the learning targets. Because your lesson objectives, what you are trying to teach the learner, is what the learner is going to demonstrate via their learning. So there's a target that they're going to try to demonstrate. So it's them demonstrating what the learning lesson objectives are. That's another way of saying it. So it's still the same thing. Essentially what I said before. The student's going to demonstrate what they know and are able to do. So that's the learning target. The learning target is aligned with a lesson objective.
So those people who's going to assess this edTPA, we want to see that the lessons that we are teaching, the students should be or must be able to apply this objectives in their personal
in that lesson. Then when they look at day 2, the second consecutive day, they are going to, it may not necessarily happen in all lessons, but what you taught previously should be reflected in the next lesson. Because lessons, or when you're teaching somebody, they progressively get harder, and when it gets harder, it means that what you've already taught is already the knowledge and skills that was already taught. That means they know it, they can demonstrate it, is already embedded in the new lesson, where you don't necessarily need to reteach it, because if you have to reteach it, they didn't learn it, but it can be reinforced in the next lesson because they have to do it again. But they're doing it again while you're teaching them a new skill. And so on and so forth. So level 5, contingency points where the candidate can make adjustments to learning tasks and or supports. This essentially, to me, doesn't need to be here. It should be an automatic. Whatever you do, regardless of this rubric here, you should always have plan B and plan C and plan D. Because you are giving your best estimate as to how the student is going to perform based on the data that you collected. But if there's any type of misalignment, like the measure you use wasn't the best measure for the student, that sort of thing. Remember I talked about limiting? Either you know less about the student or the student didn't demonstrate how much they know. The next lesson, there might be more of a misalignment. So you have to have backup plan. So this backup plan should always be in everything that you do. But just, for some reason they want you to have it here because what you are doing, based on the title of the rubric, and the question is, you are going to push the envelope. So what they're trying to do here, essentially, is say to you as the educator, don't just design lesson objectives and target learning targets that the student, the student can do. You got to push the student. But sometimes when you push the student, you might reach their envelope. So you got to have a plan B, just in case you planned too much for the student. Otherwise, you're going to be stuck there without a lesson and nothing else to do, and then the class might get a little crazy. You see what they're trying to do here? And plans call for engaging each focused learner in using his or her knowledge of strengths and needs to self-manage supports or challenges. So, hint, hint, we already see that self-management and self-regulation is an area that they kind of like in the rubrics. Naturally, any learner who you are working with needs to be able to self-monitor and self-regulate his or her learning. Otherwise, if you try to remove scaffolds or supports, they are not going to be able to do it by themselves independently. So this might be a good area to think about including. Because then the reviewer might say, not only is this educator teaching students the content, they are also teaching the student how to learn. So you are teaching them the content, so they are learning the content, and they are learning how to learn. So making connections. So when you are trying to focus on these lesson objectives and you are focusing on what the learning target is for the student or for the learner, focused learner, they have to acquire the skill. So there's like a basic level, right? So that's acquisition. They have to become fluent with the skill. They have to practice it enough to be able to do it well and with accuracy. They have to be able to do it on their own over time. So once they become fluent, they should be able to maintain it. They can take that skill and apply it to another area. So you teach them a writing skill, they can take that writing skill and go use it in science, social studies, blah, blah, blah. Hopefully, with time, when they become a self-regulating learner, they can self-monitor, they can learn, they will know enough about themselves and how they learn to be able to adapt what was taught of them. So when that strategy or the complexity of the strategy is not aligned with a new task that they're being asked to do, they can adapt that strategy that you taught them to be able to bring it up to another level to complete that task. So in terms of acquisition, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go back to these different levels and talk about them slightly. Learning the skill, that has to be taught correctly. They need to attend. They will only attend if it's at their level of comprehension or ability. Provide immediate corrective feedback. And measure frequently. And that's because you are initially teaching them this. So you yourself need a lot of feedback to be able to provide them another prompt that's targeted. In terms of fluency, they have to do it with ease and speed. And do it within a context that they will be doing it again eventually when they do it independently. You also want to provide them structured practice so they don't make any mistakes. Same thing, feedback, but it has to be immediate and corrective. And you're going to do the same thing again. Always going to measure. When you're trying to ensure that there's maintenance, without any supports or reteaching. Or else you have to go back and reteach, right? Can perform the skill in authentic contexts. You may need to differentially reinforce to make sure that you are actually making that skill robust enough so that way they have enough of it's almost like giving them enough varied experiences so when they encounter something a little different, they're not going to freak out on you. Or in terms of themselves, they won't like get anxious. Like, oh my goodness, I don't know how to do this. But they really do know how to do it. It's what they haven't been presented with it. So what you're going to do is progressively thin it out, or progressively remove the scaffolds. That's the whole goal in special ed, is to give them what they need, support them, and then teach them not to use it anymore. Because if we let them keep on using it, they're never going to exit special ed. So when you try to generalize, you start providing them experiences outside of the training condition. You help them demonstrate the skill in a new context. Again, always providing feedback. And then when you're trying to help them adapt, the skill should be solidified. Don't start teaching them how to adapt if it's not a skill that's solidified. It's not part of them. They have to own it. What you're also going to have to do is, you are going to have to overtly make it apparent to the student that this is why you are going to adapt this strategy. Because the way you have been using it is this way. Now you're being asked to do X. X is different from Y. The strategy was only good for Y, and this is how the strategy worked for Y. The strategy does not work for X, or it works for X up to this point. From this point, you will need to make some changes. And reinforce, reinforce, reinforce. So rubric 3. The question: how does the candidate use knowledge of the focused learners in terms of research and/or theory to justify decisions? Makes clear connections to research and/or theory and each focused learner's strengths and needs with specific adaptations for each focused learner. So, what you're going to have to do, I remember someone had mentioned this. Yeah, I think it was Dr. Yan. About referencing. You might have to talk about theory. Oh yeah, I remember what he said about Piaget. Don't just say Piaget, but give detailed explanation as to what aspect of Piaget is associated with the learner and all this other, making the connections. So here are some general websites. What Works Clearinghouse is typically a website for general education curriculum, and your focus here is to provide students access to the general education curriculum. The other websites are more aligned with special ed. So if you go to such a website, you can look and get publications and reviews of different programs, different strategies. So as you're making your lesson plans, you can come here, download some PDFs. You will actually have the research and the level of support or validity for the research. It's moderately effective. It's highly recommended to use this strategy, that sort of thing. And then you can use that same language in your write-up. I use collaborative strategic reading about a strategy that is that is highly supported, or whatever they say here. I don't know what they say for each strategy. So that's one. You can go to journals such as Teaching Exceptional Children, which is a journal for practitioners of special ed. Gives you strategies that are used in the field by special educators. You can go to the divisions for the Council for Exceptional Children, go to membership, and you go to special interest divisions, and it'll bring you to this page. You will scroll down, pick the division that matches the type of learner that you have in your edTPA. So if it's students with, autism, then you can go here, and then that's the division where people talk about autism. You can find strategies or other websites and links, and these are all the divisions for different types of disability categories. Here's RTI, LD, that's more specific. Let me just finish up to rubric 5 and then I'll stop. At least we'll finish the most important one, the planning aspect. So here, supporting language or communication or development for access and performance. Oh. Do you guys mind staying another 10 minutes or so? Is that okay? Okay. I just have some videos I want to show you. I think it's kind of important.
As long as we pass.
All right.
As long as we pass.
All right, so here, the question. How does the candidate identify and support language communication demands to provide access to the language function and learning targets? So this is absolutely critical because you can design a wonderful lesson, but if you don't understand how well the student, in terms of receptive language, is understanding what's being asked of him or her, when you observe the student and try to measure what the student can do, you're going to say the student is at a lower level, but maybe in actuality, the student didn't understand what you were saying. And it doesn't have to be that the student is an ESL, English language learner. It could be that they have difficulty with language. So here's an example I'm going to share with you. So identifies vocabulary and/or symbols and other language or communication demands related to the learning target. What the student is supposed to demonstrate in terms of knowledge and skills and language function. Essentially how they're going to use the language to be able to demonstrate their knowledge and skills. Or how they are going to use the language in terms of receptive to be able to demonstrate knowledge and skills. It justifies why it supports why you do what you do for language to help the student, again, access the general education curriculum. So let's go to it. So you see how important language is? I mean, that's just as simplistic as it can be, but it happens in the classroom. And you might be unaware it's happening. And you might say, oh my goodness, this kid doesn't know what's going on here. And you think it's the content, but it's really the language. So that's why that rubric is important. So, this is the last rubric. So let me show you these, because this is to help you prime your thinking. So let's just look at the rubric quickly. Planning assessments. So you're planning for the assessments to monitor and support learning. How are the assessments and daily assessment records selected or designed to provide evidence of the focused learner's progress toward the lesson objectives? So the first video, they're about 5 minutes each, I think. The first video is on differentiated instruction. And what I wanted to do, and continue on with the next section, which is on instruction, is to help you be able to characterize appropriately in your edTPA portfolio the overlaps and differences between differentiating instruction, universally designing instruction, and individually designing instruction. You may have a focused learner or just learners in general in your classroom that will do well when you differentiate, do well when you universally provide access, but may need individualized support. So essentially, I will go back a little bit. When you design a lesson, design it in a way where you provide as much access to the content via the standards as possible. Naturally, because we vary as individuals, there are going to be some learners that do not or are unable to access that lesson plan. If you differentiate within the lesson, you increase the likelihood of the learners who are unable to access the universal lesson are now able to better understand what they need to do and what they need to learn because you provided them other types of opportunities via differentiating the content, the process, or giving them an opportunity to demonstrate what they know or can produce via differentiated products. Instead of writing a paper, they can actually do a video on it if writing or written expression is difficult for them. If your goal is not really for them to write, but to demonstrate verbal knowledge, what's the difference between someone writing a paper and reading it and someone memorizing it and acting it out, kind of? You see where I'm going with this? Now, what happens a lot, people think that when you differentiate, you are individualizing. You're not individualizing. You can individualize instruction and provide differentiated instruction within individualized instruction. But if you differentiate only, there's a possibility that a learner that has an IEP may not receive individualized instruction within a differentiated lesson. So I'm using Carol Ann Tomlinson's words or her video as a basis for our discussion or for you to think. And then the next one is